Honestly, kid, I'm sure your mom was a real ace in her little weekend Cessna, but this is a $35 million F divided by a minus 35C Lightning 2 simulator. It's not a video game. Why don't you go grab a juice box with the other children before you smudge the glass? The crowd of assembled officers, their families, and visiting dignitaries offered a ripple of uncomfortable, sycophantic laughter. Lieutenant Marcus Calloway, slick and self-assured in his perfectly pressed flight suit, beamed as if he had just delivered the wittiest line in naval aviation history. He was the master of this domain, the gleaming, refrigerated sanctum of the Naval Air Station's Advanced Flight Simulation Center, and he reveled in the spotlight. But the girl, the target of his condescension, didn't even flinch. She just stood there, a whisper of a person amidst the loud, self-important hum of the facility. Perhaps 17, dressed in worn jeans and a plain gray t-shirt that seemed to absorb the light around her, she offered no retort, no flash of teenage indignation, no defensive justification of her mother's supposed piloting skills. Her hands remained loosely in her pockets, her posture a study in relaxed equilibrium. Her gaze, calm and unervingly steady, simply drifted from Calloway's smug face back to the wraparound panoramic screen where a simulated carrier deck bobbed in a digital sea. This utter lack of reaction was, to Calloway, more infuriating than any argument. It was a quiet, profound indifference that his ego couldn't parse. He had expected a reaction, a performance he could then dismantle. Instead, he got nothing. Silence. A silence that began to feel less like submission and more like judgment. From the back of the observation room, standing half-hidden behind a server rack, Rear Admiral Vance watched the exchange, his old eyes narrowing. He saw Calloway's preening, a peacock displaying feathers of unearned confidence. And he saw the girl. He saw the way she stood, not with the slouch of a disinterested teen, but with the centered stillness of a martial artist. He saw how her eyes didn't just look at the screen, but scanned it, a practiced, methodical pattern that took an altitude, airspeed, fuel state, and carrier alignment in a single fluid sweep. He saw a professional calm that he hadn't witnessed in pilots with 1,000 hours in their logbooks. Calloway, oblivious, continued his performance, gesturing grandly to the simulator cockpit. As I was saying, he announced to the room, his voice dripping with authority that was only skin-deep. Our systems can replicate any scenario, from a simple carrier landing to a full-scale fleet engagement. The processing power in this room alone exceeds that of the entire naval fleet in the year 2000. It is a testament to our technological superiority, our commitment to ensuring our aviators are the most prepared, most lethal fighting force on the planet. We leave nothing to chance. We account for every variable. We master the chaos before we ever have to face it. He was reciting a speech, words he had polished until they shone, but they sounded hollow, a fragile shell of jargon around an empty core. The girl, Maya, remained silent, her attention fixed on the telemetry data scrolling down a secondary monitor, her expression unreadable. She wasn't listening to the words. She was reading the machine. And in the machine, she saw a flicker, a tiny anomaly in the code that no one else, least of all the peacock in the flight suit, had noticed. If you believe that true competence doesn't need to announce itself, type silence below. The air in the simulation center was thick with the scent of chilled air, ozone, and the faint, bitter aroma of institutional coffee. It was a cathedral of technology, a place where the gods of war were worshipped in algorithms and photons. Lieutenant Calloway was its high priest, and this Dependence Day tour was his sermon. He moved with a practiced, almost theatrical grace, pointing out the banks of humming servers, explaining the intricacies of the haptic feedback systems, and dropping acronyms like they were sacred rites. He was young, ambitious, and possessed the dangerous combination of just enough knowledge to be an authority and not enough experience to be wise. He saw the world as a ladder, and every interaction was a chance to place his foot on a higher rung, often by pushing someone else down. The girl, Maya, was an easy target. She was an anomaly in the polished, hierarchical environment. She was quiet where everyone else was loud. She was still where everyone else was restless. Her presence was a disruption to his carefully curated narrative of overwhelming naval power. He needed to reassert control, to put the anomaly back in its box. "You see," he continued, directing his words at a visiting congressman, but his gaze at Maya, "it takes a very specific kind of mind to handle this level of complexity. You can't just have good reflexes. You need years of training, a deep understanding of physics, aerodynamics, weapon systems. It's a language, really. One that you can't learn from a manual or, no offense," he added with a smirk, "from your mom's flying lessons again." The dutiful chuckles. Maya's silence continued to stretch, becoming a presence of its own. It was not an empty silence. It was a weighted silence, filled with an unspoken history that Calloway was too arrogant to even imagine. Her unassuming appearance was a form of camouflage, a lifetime of learning to be invisible in rooms filled with uniforms and medals, of understanding that the most important person in the room was often the one who spoke the least. Her mother had taught her that. Legacy wasn't about the stories you told. It was about the standards you kept. Respect wasn't something you demanded with a loud voice. It was a gravity you generated through quiet, undeniable competence. While Calloway pontificated, Maya's eyes traced the power conduits running along the ceiling, noted the placement of the emergency cutoffs, and registered the subtle change in the pitch of the central server's cooling fans. She was a diagnostician in a room full of tourists. She was a professional in a room of amateurs led by a performer. Rear Admiral Vance, still watching from the periphery, felt a memory stir. He remembered a briefing years ago in a classified setting, a windowless room where a pilot, a woman with the same unnerving calm as this girl, had explained a system's failure in a prototype aircraft. She hadn't used jargon or bluster. She had spoken with a quiet, devastating precision, deconstructing a catastrophic event into a series of logical, preventable steps. Her name had been Morgan, Eleanor Morgan. He dismissed the thought as a coincidence, a trick of an old man's memory. But he kept watching the girl, a growing sense of unease and profound curiosity beginning to eclipse the day's tedious formalities. He felt he was on the precipice of something significant, a moment when the carefully constructed order of things was about to be irrevocably and justly upended. And at the center of it all was the quiet girl in the gray t-shirt, a silent storm gathering in the heart of the machine. The crisis began not with a bang, but with a flicker. On the massive panoramic screen, the brilliant blue of the simulated Pacific Ocean momentarily glitched, pixelating into a splash of garish green static before snapping back. A single, high-pitched beep, quickly silenced, echoed through the room. Calloway faltered mid-sentence, his practiced smile tightening. "Just a minor data refresh," he announced a little too quickly. The system processes terabytes of data per second, but then it happened again. A bank of secondary monitors displaying engine performance and hydraulics suddenly went dark. A cascade of amber warning lights began to flash on the main console, each one a silent scream in the language of the machine. The simulated F-35C, which had been a graceful holding pattern over the carrier, began to shudder violently. A synthesized voice, calm and robotic, filled the room. "Warning. Multiple flight control system failure. Warning. Hydraulic pressure 0. Warning." Calloway's face went pale. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't one of the pre-programmed emergency scenarios he trained pilots on. This was a genuine, cascading systems crash. The software, the heart of the $35 million machine, was having a catastrophic, unrecoverable seizure. "Technicians, run a Level 3 diagnostic," he barked, his voice cracking with the first hint of panic. Two enlisted technicians rushed to a side console, their fingers flying across keyboards, but the screens just filled with scrolling lines of incomprehensible error codes. The simulated jet was now in a terminal nosedive. On the main screen, the blue horizon tilted crazily and was replaced by the terrifying, fast-approaching grid of the ocean surface. "Reboot the primary flight controller," Calloway ordered, his voice now shrill. "It's not responding, sir," one of the technicians yelled back. "The system is completely locked out." The VIPs murmured, their expressions shifting from impressed to concerned. The carefully constructed illusion of effortless technological dominance was shattering. In its place was a raw, ugly display of failure. Calloway, sweating under the cold lights, fumbled with the controls himself, his movements clumsy and desperate. He was a priest whose gods had just died. And in that moment of chaos and collapsing arrogance, a calm, quiet voice cut through the noise. "The auxiliary power bus is still active," every head turned. It was the girl, Maya. She had moved from the back of the room and was now standing beside the main console, her expression one of intense, focused analysis. She wasn't looking at the panicked lieutenant or the stunned crowd. She was looking at a small, overlooked power routing display, a tiny green light that glowed with defiant life amidst a sea of red. Calloway stared at her, dumbfounded. "What? That's irrelevant. The flight software is corrupted. We have to do a hard reset. You don't have time," she stated, not as an opinion, but as a fact. "The impact is in 45 seconds. A hard reset takes 2 minutes." She then did something that broke every rule of protocol. She reached past the lieutenant, her movements not hesitant or aggressive, but fluid and certain, like a river finding its natural course. Her fingers, long and steady, touched the screen. "My mother taught me this sequence," she said softly, almost to herself, and she began to work. The demonstration of skill that followed was not a frantic, Hollywood-style hacking sequence. It was a masterpiece of methodical precision, a slow, deliberate ballet of touch and response. Maya's fingers moved across the glowing interface, not with the speed of a gamer, but with the unhurried confidence of a bomb disposal expert who has done this 1,000 times before. She didn't just press buttons. She coaxed the machine, rerouting power, bypassing entire blocks of corrupted code, and manually allocating residual hydraulic pressure with a surgeon's touch. She was breathing life back into the ghost in the machine, not by force, but by a deep, intuitive understanding of its soul. The room was utterly silent now. The only sound the hum of the servers and the rising whine of the simulated wind over the dying aircraft's canopy. Calloway stood frozen, a statue of disbelief, as this unassuming teenager did the impossible. On the main screen, the terrifying plunge towards the ocean slowed. The nose of the F-35C, against all laws of its own broken physics, began to lift. She had bypassed the primary flight controls and was now flying the multi-ton aircraft using nothing but manual trim adjustments and minute bursts from the emergency attitude thrusters, a feat of aviation that was, in the real world, a theoretical impossibility. She coaxed the crippled bird into a stable, unpowered glide. The altimeter stopped its frantic unwinding. The ocean, which had been rushing up to meet them, was now a surface they were gliding over. With a final series of precise inputs, she lined the dead aircraft up with the distant carrier deck. A dead stick landing, in a stealth fighter. A maneuver so difficult, so dangerous, that it was spoken of only in whispers by the most seasoned test pilots. The simulated aircraft, now a multi-ton glider, kissed the deck with the faintest chirp of tires, caught the third wire perfectly, and screeched to a halt with meters to spare. For a full 10 seconds after the motion stopped, the room remained in a state of suspended animation. The silence was absolute, a deafening vacuum where Calloway's arrogance had once been. It was the sound of 100 assumptions shattering at once. The technicians stared, their mouths agape. The congressman looked from the screen to the girl, his expression one of pure, unadulterated awe. Calloway, his face ashen, finally managed to stammer a single, broken phrase. That's not possible. That's a classified protocol." "How?" He didn't get to finish his question. A heavy hand landed on his shoulder, and he turned to see Rear Admiral Vance standing behind him, his face carved from granite. The Admiral's eyes, however, were not on Calloway. They were fixed on Maya, and in them was a look of profound, dawning recognition and something that bordered on reverence. He had seen that impossibly graceful landing once before, not in a simulator, but on a grainy piece of gun camera footage from a Black Ops mission that officially never happened. The silence in the room finally broke, not with applause, but with a single authoritative voice that cut through the stunned atmosphere like a carrier launch. "Lieutenant Calloway, stand down," Rear Admiral Vance commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. He didn't wait for a reply. He moved past the disgraced junior officer, his steps measured and deliberate, parting the sea of onlookers until he stood directly in front of Maya. He didn't address her immediately. Instead, his gaze dropped to the collar of her simple denim jacket, where a small, almost unnoticeable pin was fastened. It was a single burnished silver star, flanked by a pair of swept-back wings. It was not a standard-issue military insignia. It was smaller, more elegant, and clearly custom-made. To most, it was a piece of simple jewelry. To Vance, it was a ghost from his past, a symbol as potent and exclusive as a king's signet ring. "I've only seen one other person in my entire 35-year career wear that pin," Vance said, his voice quiet but resonant, filling the cavernous room. He looked up, meeting Maya's calm gaze. She was a test pilot, the best I ever knew. He turned to his aide, a young ensign who was staring at the scene with wide, uncomprehending eyes. "Ensign, give me the service record for Fleet Admiral Eleanor Morgan." Now, the name dropped into the room like a depth charge, sending out ripples of shock and disbelief. Fleet Admiral, the highest possible rank. A 4-star admiral, but one with a 5th star bestowed by special designation, a rank held by only a handful of legends in the history of the United States Navy. The name Morgan was whispered in the Pentagon, a near-mythical figure who operated in the highest echelons of strategic command and the deepest shadows of black projects. The ensign, fumbling with his tablet, quickly typed in the name. The security clearance required to access the file made his device chime 3 times before the information appeared. He paled, his eyes scanning the screen. "Sir," the ensign began, his voice trembling slightly. "The file is extensive. Read the summary classifications," Vance ordered, his eyes never leaving Maya. The ensign began to read, his voice gaining a tone of hushed awe with each word. "Name, Morgan, Eleanor J. Rank, Fleet Admiral. Current command, Commander, United States Pacific Fleet. Flight hours, over 6,000, with 4,000 logged in experimental and classified airframes. Primary aircraft qualifications. Sir, the list is too long. Includes everything from the F-14 Tomcat to the State Route 91 Aurora prototype." A gasp went through the room. The Aurora was a myth, a hypersonic spy plane that the government didn't officially admit existed. Notable awards: Navy Cross, Distinguished Flying Cross with 3 oak leaf clusters, Legion of Merit, Purple Heart. The ensign paused, swallowing hard. Special qualifications: Chief Test Pilot for Project Chimera, Lead Strategist for Operation Nightfall. Developed 17 classified combat maneuvers, including the emergency unpowered carrier approach, colloquially known among the Tier 1 community as the Morgan Glide. At the mention of that name, Calloway physically recoiled as if struck. The Morgan Glide, the impossible maneuver this girl had just executed with flawless precision. It wasn't just a classified protocol. It was someone's legacy. A legacy named Morgan. "Continue, ensign," Vance commanded. "Next of kin." The ensign's eyes widened as he read the final line on the screen. He looked up from the tablet, his gaze shifting from the screen to the quiet girl in the gray t-shirt. He licked his dry lips. Sole dependent. Morgan Maya. Daughter. The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place, and the collective shock in the room was a palpable force. In that moment of stunning revelation, Rear Admiral Vance did something that no one in that room had ever seen him do for anyone short of the president. He squared his shoulders, brought his heels together with an audible click, and snapped to the most rigid, impeccable salute of his life. He wasn't saluting a teenage girl. He was saluting the living, breathing embodiment of a legend. He was saluting the bloodline of his commanding officer, the highest-ranking officer in the entire United States Navy. "Ma'am," Vance said, his voice thick with a respect that was absolute and unconditional. On behalf of Naval Air Station Coronado, my apologies for the informal reception. We were not aware that your mother's daughter was gracing us with her presence today. He held the salute, his arm a rigid testament to a lifetime of service and adherence to the chain of command. The gesture reordered the universe in that room. It elevated the quiet girl from an anonymous civilian to royalty. It transformed Calloway from an authority figure into a fool. The silence that followed was different now. It was not a silence of shock, but of profound, humbled respect. It was the silence of 100 people simultaneously realizing they had been standing in the presence of greatness without even knowing it. It was the silence that follows a thunderclap, when the world feels both smaller and infinitely more mysterious. After a moment that stretched into eternity, Maya gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the only acknowledgement needed. The salute was returned not with a gesture, but with the same quiet dignity she had displayed all along. Rear Admiral Vance finally lowered his arm and turned, his face a thundercloud of righteous fury, to face the trembling lieutenant. "Calloway," he began, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl that promised a reckoning. "You stand here in a flight suit you haven't truly earned, guarding a machine you don't truly understand. You are the uniform of service built on the sacrifices of giants. Yet you have shown respect for nothing but the sound of your own voice. You assumed knowledge based on a uniform. You assumed incompetence based on age and gender. You mistook silence for weakness and arrogance for strength." Vance took a step closer, his presence overwhelming the younger man. "Today you are not just rude to a civilian, Lieutenant. You publicly insulted the daughter of Fleet Admiral Eleanor Morgan, the woman who holds the fate of the Pacific Fleet in her hands, the woman who signs the orders that send men like me into harm's way, the woman who personally flight tested the very software architecture you couldn't even reboot." He let the words hang in the air, each one a hammer blow against Calloway's shattered pride. "That impossible maneuver you just witnessed, the Morgan Glide, it wasn't designed in a lab. It was invented by her mother in the real world, during a real-world incident over the South China Sea that is so classified, you don't even have the clearance to read the redacted report. She performed that maneuver in a real F-35 with its spine broken by a surface-to-air missile, with both engines on fire, and landed it on a carrier in a typhoon. She saved the aircraft, she saved the intelligence it was carrying, and she saved herself. You don't read about that in a textbook, Lieutenant. You don't learn it in a simulator. You learn it from the ghost who clawed it out of the sky through sheer force of will. And that ghost taught it to her daughter." Vance gestured dismissively at Calloway. "You are relieved of your duties. Report to my office at 0800 tomorrow. I suggest you spend the night contemplating the vastness of your own ignorance without another word." Vance turned his back on the disgraced lieutenant and walked back to Maya, his demeanor softening instantly. "Ma'am," he said gently, "is there anything we can get for you?" Maya finally spoke, her first full sentence of the day. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of her mother's legacy. "No, thank you, Admiral," she said. "I was just waiting for my mom. She's landing in 10 minutes." The story of what happened in the Advanced Flight Simulation Center that day did not spread. It detonated. It moved through the base with the speed of a signal flare, a burst of incandescent gossip that illuminated the rigid, hierarchical world of the naval station. It leaped from the stunned VIPs to their aides, from the technicians to the enlisted barracks, from the officers' club to the flight lines. By evening chow, every sailor and officer on Coronado knew the tale. It was a story that had everything: hubris, humility, a secret legend, a quiet hero, and a moment of pure, unadulterated vindication. They called her the Sim Ghost. They called the event Calloway's Folly. The simulator itself was unofficially but permanently rechristened Morgan's Perch. The legend grew with each telling. In some versions, she had rewired the simulator with a paperclip. In others, she had landed the aircraft blindfolded. The embellishments were unnecessary, for the truth was more potent than any fiction. The story became a modern parable, a teaching tool passed down from salty chiefs to fresh-faced ensigns, a lesson on the profound danger of assumptions. It was a reminder that the most formidable people are often the ones you overlook, that true strength doesn't need to advertise, and that legacy is a quiet, powerful current that runs deeper than any uniform or rank. For Lieutenant Marcus Calloway, the event was a professional and personal cataclysm. He was formally reprimanded, a black mark on his record that would follow him for the rest of his career. But the administrative punishment was nothing compared to the public humbling. He became a ghost on his own base, a cautionary tale whispered about as he walked past. For days, he was lost in a fog of shame and anger. He replayed the scene in his mind 1,000 times, his own arrogant words echoing back at him, each syllable a fresh wave of humiliation. He had built his identity on a fragile scaffolding of superficial knowledge and unearned authority, and a 17-year-old girl had demolished it with a few quiet taps on a screen. But as the days turned into a week, something shifted within him. The anger gave way to a grudging respect, which slowly blossomed into a genuine, consuming curiosity. How could she have known? How could she have remained so calm? What kind of person, what kind of mother, creates that kind of quiet competence? He realized his failure was not just a breach of etiquette. It was a failure of perception. He had looked at Maya Morgan and seen only what he expected to see, a child. He had failed to see the person who was actually there. Driven by a desperate need for understanding, he sought her out. He found her a few days later, sitting alone on a bench overlooking the bay, watching the fleet carriers glide in and out of port. He approached hesitantly, his usual swagger completely gone, replaced by a stiff, awkward humility. "Ma'am," he began, the word feeling foreign and inadequate in his mouth. Maya looked up, her expression neutral. Calloway stood before her, his perfectly pressed uniform now feeling like costume. I wanted to apologize. What I said, how I acted, there's no excuse. It was arrogant and unprofessional. I was wrong." He took a deep breath, the confession costing him dearly. "I was hoping, if you have a moment, that you could show me the sequence. I don't understand how you stabilize the glide." Maya looked at him for a long moment, her gaze analytical. She wasn't looking for contrition. She was assessing his intent. She saw that the arrogance had been burned away, leaving behind the raw, genuine curiosity of student. She gave a slight nod. She didn't have a tablet or a manual. She simply picked up a stick and began to draw in the sand. She sketched the control interface, the power conduits, the flow of data. Her explanation was as precise and economical as her actions had been in the simulator. She didn't use jargon to impress. She used simple, direct language to teach. "My mother always said that most pilots try to force the machine to obey," Maya explained softly, her finger tracing a line in the sand that represented the flow of auxiliary power. "They fight it, but the machine is always talking to you. You just have to be quiet enough to listen. It tells you what's broken, and it tells you what still works." She looked up from her drawing and met his eyes. "It's not about the hands. It's not about reflexes. It's about knowing what the machine needs and what it's going to do a second before it does it. It's about being calmer than the chaos." In that moment, Calloway understood. He was being given more than a technical lesson. He was being given a philosophy. It was a glimpse into the mind of a true professional, a creed passed from a legendary mother to her daughter. The data recording of Maya's flawless deadstick landing was archived, locked behind the highest security protocols. It was given a simple, elegant designation. The Morgan Standard elite test pilots and Top Gun instructors would occasionally be granted access to watch it, and they would leave the viewing room in humbled silence. It became the new benchmark for excellence, a perfect, unattainable performance that served as a permanent reminder that the limits of what was possible were often defined by the people you least expected. The story was no longer just gossip. It had become institutional memory, a part of the living history of the United States Navy. A few months after the incident at the simulation center, the ripples of Maya Morgan's quiet demonstration continued to expand, subtly but irrevocably altering the culture of the training wing. The change was most visible in Marcus Calloway. The once preening lieutenant, known for his sharp tongue and brittle ego, was a different man. The public humbling had been a crucible, burning away his arrogance and forging something new in its place. A quiet, focused humility. He became a better instructor, not because he had gained new technical knowledge, but because he had gained a new perspective. He started listening to his students, truly listening. He learned to look past the surface, past the swagger of some and the nervousness of others, searching for that spark of intuitive understanding, that calm at the center of the storm. He often took new groups of ensigns, fresh out of flight school, not to the simulators first, but to the bench overlooking the bay where Maya had taught him. He would tell them a story, not as a piece of gossip, but as a foundational lesson. Your biggest enemy isn't the guy in the other jet, he would say, his voice stripped of its former arrogance. It's not a surface-to-air missile, and it's not mechanical failure. Your biggest enemy is your own assumption. It's the certainty that you know who someone is based on what they look like. It's the belief that you have nothing to learn from the person standing quietly in the corner. He would point to the simulation center, a gleaming monument on the horizon. In there, a 17-year-old civilian girl, with no flight hours and no uniform, taught me more about flying than the entire Naval Academy. She taught me that competence is quiet. She taught me that respect is earned through action, not demanded by rank. She taught me that the most important words in any cockpit are the ones the machine is speaking to you, and you can only hear them if you shut up and listen. The story of Maya and the Morgan glide became a permanent part of the unofficial curriculum, a piece of institutional folklore used to inoculate new aviators against the disease of arrogance. The legend served as a constant reminder that the uniform made you an officer, but did not automatically make you a professional. Professionalism was something deeper, a state of being forged in discipline, humility, and a relentless pursuit of excellence. It was a quality that could be found in a fleet admiral commanding a battle group from a flagship, and it could be found in her daughter, sitting quietly in a room full of noise, demonstrating a legacy that needed no introduction. The Morgan Standard became more than just a data file. It became an ideal. A testament to the idea that true greatness isn't measured in the volume of your voice, but in the precision of your actions. It was a tribute to a mother who had reached the pinnacle of her profession and a daughter who carried that legacy not as a burden, but as a quiet, internal compass. The real legacy of that day was not the embarrassment of one lieutenant or the vindication of one girl. It was the enduring lesson that echoed through the halls of the naval base long after Maya Morgan had gone. It was a lesson about the power of silence, the strength of humility, and the simple, profound truth that what you are is always, in the end, more important than what you appear to be. True worth is not declared, it is demonstrated. It is not something you claim. It is something others recognize in the deafening silence that follows an impossible act, performed with impossible calm. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where true respect is earned in silence, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.